Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea potentially on course for a daily high number of new COVID-19 infections as the Omicron variant continues to spread like wildfire. Officials warning the country could see more than 100,000 new cases a day before too long. Controversy on the ice at the Beijing Winter Olympics. Two South Korean short track speed skaters on the wrong end of some very questionable calls by referees that see them disqualified from the semi-finals of the 1,000-meter event. The DQs allow Chinese skaters to advance to the final. Plus, European troops head to the east of the continent as Russian troops continue to line the border around Ukraine. There's a flurry of diplomacy as well. US President Joe Biden welcoming the German Chancellor at the White House and French President Emmanuel Macron in Moscow for a meeting with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin.
Hello and welcome to this Tuesday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. February 8th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Over the course of the next 60 minutes or so, we'll be taking a look at the biggest news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. We start with the COVID-19 situation. South Korea is again expected to see a record number of infections on Tuesday, possibly topping 40,000.
Meanwhile, authorities have announced new measures to treat at-home patients, mainly to make better use of resources amid the rampant spread of the Omicron variant. For more on this, our reporter Choi Min-jung is here in the studio with us. Good morning, Min-jung.
Good morning.
So let's start with the local tally for today.
Well, again, we're expecting the daily tally to reach close to 40,000 today. From midnight to 9 p.m. Monday, South Korea saw more than 31,700 cases. It's the very first time the figure has surpassed the 30,000 mark for this time period. The tally jumped by more than 4,000 cases from the previous day, while it has more than doubled compared to a week ago. At this point, we are no longer seeing the weekend effect coming into play, as we usually tend to see fewer cases drop as fewer people get tested during the weekend. Recent data shows that around 1 in 4 people getting tested are infected with COVID-19. And given the current trend, authorities are predicting the daily tally to reach as many as 170,000 by the end of February.
Yeah, pretty remarkable numbers if that does materialize. In regards to how South Korea is dealing with Omicron, the country is coming up with its own tailored Omicron strategy to try and tackle the problem, specifically in regards to treating Omicron at home rather than at the hospital.
Right. Health authorities have announced that at-home treatment will be focused more on those at high risk. Patients recovering at home will be handled largely in 2 groups, an intensive management group and a regular management group. Those eligible to receive intensive care will be people aged 60 and above, or those taking oral COVID-19 treatment pills. Treatment kits, which include fever reducer, thermometer, and a self-test, will now only be provided to those in the intensive management group, and they'll continue to get 2 health checks daily. Those who are asymptomatic or have mild symptoms will be categorized under the regular management group. They will not be provided with treatment kits and will no longer be monitored, but if needed, they can visit local hospitals for non-contact treatment.
Now, Min-jung, let's shift to the vaccination front. We hear authorities are preparing to administer the 4th shots of COVID-19 vaccines. Tell us more on that.
Right. Authorities announced Monday that they are planning to administer 4th dose of the vaccine to people at nursing hospitals and care facilities. They said this was mainly to prevent cluster and breakthrough infections at these venues. Data has shown that there were a total of 66 cases of cluster infections in January, resulting in nearly 2,500 patients. And there were 7 cases of cluster infections in the first week of February. What's also concerning is the relatively higher risk of breakthrough infections among seniors who have gotten 3rd shots. Although those infected with Omicron are less likely to become severely ill than when infected by the Delta variant, authorities are saying that the number of critically ill patients can increase if more people at higher risk are infected. Authorities are considering to administer the Novavax vaccine for those who haven't yet received a jab.
Now, it's not only South Korea, of course, feeling the brunt of this rampant spread of Omicron. Other countries around the world are also having a torrid time right now. And some countries are considering whether to impose or reimpose much tougher antivirus measures.
Right, Mark. Japan has seen an all-time high figure for a Monday with cases exceeding 68,000 in a single day period. This was an increase of more than 5,000 cases on week, and the average daily figure increased 1.3-fold compared to a week ago. Japan is currently considering extending the quasi-state of emergency in Tokyo and 12 prefectures by 2 weeks. This includes restricting business hours of restaurants and bars. Meanwhile, Hong Kong is also seeing a spike in cases due to Omicron. The country was almost COVID-19 free in the second half of 2021, but things changed since Omicron was confirmed in the country in late December. Last Saturday, Hong Kong confirmed around 300 cases, but in just 2 days on Monday, the figure doubled with over 600 cases reported. But at the same time, countries in Europe are easing restrictions as they are seeing a decline in the number of cases after hitting the peak of Omicron cases. Starting this weekend, Italy will lift outdoor mask mandates, which are due to expire on February 10th. Health authorities have decided not to extend the mandate given the improving virus situation. And things are also looking good over in the UK. The number of patients being admitted to ICU dropped to as low as 20 a day. In January, around 400 people were being admitted to ICU during the peak of the wave. The Times reported that the decline comes mainly as Omicron is less severe and 65% of the population have gotten booster shots.
All right, Min Jung, thank you so much for your report. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, in a few weeks from now, it'll be the start of a new semester at schools here in South Korea. The Education Ministry has insisted that it wants all classes taught in person despite concerns about the huge spike in Omicron infections.
To address those fears, the ministry has put out some detailed guidelines on how classrooms will be run and when schools might consider online learning. Our Shin Yeun reports.
Just weeks before students start a new semester, the Ministry of Education on Monday released a new set of virus prevention measures for schools. First, to answer a question most parents want to know, will all students be required to go back to school? The short answer is yes. The Education Ministry said that it's set on pushing through its plans to bring all students back to the classroom. But the ministry added that it's now up to each school to determine whether to do that or not based on the pandemic situation in their respective regions. The ministry did suggest indicators that could help each school decide when to implement online classes, such as 3% of all students having been infected or 15% of all students being absent because they're under quarantine or have caught COVID-19. Another important question, will schools expand their testing methods? Originally, schools have only been using PCR tests. But now, schools nationwide will also use rapid antigen test kits that only take 15 to 30 minutes. They'll also expand the number of special response teams that go to schools to conduct PCR tests. Students will then be able to receive their results within 2 hours. Schools will also prepare enough self-test kits for students to take if needed. Who can get tested and how? First, those who report symptoms after coming into close contact with a person infected with COVID-19 will be able to get a PCR test right away. Those who came into close contact but don't have any symptoms will have to test themselves with a rapid antigen test kit for a whole week. They must test themselves every other day and can only return to school if their results turn out negative. To make sure each school has enough testing kits, education boards nationwide will provide extra kits for 20% of all students and teachers in their region. As of now, already 6.5 million kits have been secured and can be used until the end of March. Shin Yeun, Arirang News.
Ahead of the presidential election in South Korea in March, the second televised debate will be held on Friday from 8 to 10 p.m. Korea time. Coming 8 days after the first debate, the four main candidates, Lee Jae-myung of the ruling Democratic Party, Yoon Suk-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party, Shim Sang-jung of the Justice Party, and An Cheol-soo of the People's Party will go toe-to-toe again. The four parties will have a rule meeting in the coming hours to discuss the format and the topic. The leaders of the U.S. and Germany say Russia will face serious consequences if it does invade Ukraine. Their show of unity came Monday following talks at the White House. They also stressed coordination and unity to address tensions in the region. Kim Hyo-san tells us more.
The leaders of the U.S. and Germany are presenting a united front against possible Russian military aggression against Ukraine. Following their first face-to-face meeting at the White House Monday, President Biden said the two countries are working hand in hand to address Russia's continued military buildup along the Ukraine border.
Germany is one of America's closest allies. We're working in lockstep to further deter Russian aggression in Europe and to address the challenges posed by China and to promote stability in the Western Balkans.
The German chancellor also stressed coordination between the two countries.
We are closest allies and working intensely together, and this is necessary for doing the steps that we have to do, for instance, fighting against Russian aggression against Ukraine.
The two leaders also said they will seek to de-escalate tensions in a diplomatic manner, declaring they share the same view that it's the best solution. In case of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, however, they added Moscow would face serious consequences, including strong sanctions. Their meeting comes as Germany's defense minister announced plans to send up to 350 more troops to Lithuania, a move aimed at bolstering NATO's eastern flank. This all coming as the leaders of France and Russia held talks in Moscow in the highest profile intervention yet by a Western leader to try and ease the crisis. French President Emmanuel Macron told his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin that he hopes to avoid war and build elements of stability for everyone. Although Ukraine's security is not negotiable, Macron urged for respect for Russia when it comes to defending its own security. Against such a backdrop, Ukraine has reportedly requested Washington deploy THAAD anti-ballistic missile defense systems in the country's east. A Russian news agency quoted a Kremlin spokesperson who warned that such a deployment would further ramp up tensions. Kim Hyo-san, Arirang News.
The US is raising red flags about 33 Chinese companies whose legitimacy cannot be verified, imposing new restrictions on their ability to receive exports from the United States. According to the US Commerce Department on Monday, the firms in question will be added onto the Unverified List, a roster of businesses worldwide that are subject to stricter control in terms of exports because American officials are unable to do their customary checks. A US-based think tank has disclosed its first in-depth open-source report on a North Korean missile operating base. Beyond Parallel, which is a website specializing in North Korean matters run by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published detailed information on the Haejung-ri missile operating base located just 25 kilometers from the Chinese border. It explained the base, which likely houses a regiment-sized unit equipped with intercontinental ballistic missiles, is active. The site added minor redevelopments of the site are still ongoing. The top diplomats and nuclear envoys of South Korea, the US and Japan will meet in the coming days in Hawaii for talks on North Korea. Watchers say it signals a sense of urgency following the regime's missile tests, as well as the North's possible resumption of nuclear and ICBM tests. Yoon Jung-min with this report.
Discussions on North Korea pick up speed this week following a series of missile tests by the regime last month, including the launch of an intermediate-range ballistic missile. The regime has also signaled a possible resumption of nuclear and ICBM tests. On Saturday, chief diplomats from South Korea, the U.S. and Japan will have a trilateral meeting in Hawaii. The meeting involves South Korea's Chung Eui-yong, Antony Blinken from the U.S., and Japan's Yoshimasa Hayashi. It'll be their first face-to-face meeting since the missile tests, apparently a sign of the urgency of the matter. The U.S. State Department says they will foster cooperation in addressing threats from North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Experts say Washington might focus on bolstering sanctions this time.
The international community's, policy platforms and preferences is gearing towards sanctions and deterrences. So I think the U.S. is trying to use the current momentum to bolster the trilateral mechanism between amongst the U.S. and Japan and South Korea.
At the same time, the diplomats will likely be seeking a breakthrough, but it remains to be seen whether Pyongyang will actually respond to calls for diplomacy. As a way to resume talks, South Korea and the U.S. have discussed providing humanitarian aid to the north and formally declaring an end to the Korean War, but there hasn't been much response from Pyongyang. Before the ministerial meeting, South Korea's nuclear envoy Do Gyu-do will meet on Thursday in Hawaii, his U.S. counterpart Sung Kim and Japanese counterpart Takehito Funakoshi. Their talks will likely focus on fine-tuning the agenda for the ministerial meeting, as they will be also part of that meeting this weekend. Separately, Do will hold bilateral meetings with his U.S. and Japanese counterparts. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. Last week, South Korean Foreign Minister Jung Eui-yong expressed his deep disappointment upon hearing news Japan was pressing ahead with its nomination for the 2023 UNESCO World Heritage listing of a mine which South Korea says is linked to the forced labor of Koreans before and during World War II. According to earlier reports, Japan was not planning to make a recommendation this year, but it pressed ahead anyway.
Tokyo wants to register the mine on Sado Island in Niigata Prefecture on the coast of the East Sea. Seoul's top diplomat says it shows Japan still cannot admit to or apologize for its many wartime atrocities against Korea. Japan responded by saying South Korea's argument about the mine is unacceptable. For more on this and strained Seoul-Tokyo relations in general, we connect to Song Se-ryun, a professor of law from Kyunghee University. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So firstly, on the Sado mine situation, how do you see it playing around? Do you think Seoul's protests will have an impact on Japan and perhaps more importantly on UNESCO?
Well, process-wise, the UNESCO makes a determination on the listing based on the recommendation by the International Council on Monuments and Sites and the World Conservation Union. We can look to a similar case before when Japan listed the Hashima Island mine. That location was also the site where forced labor during the war took place. Because of the Korean government's raising the issue at the time, the site was approved on the condition of full disclosure that the forced labor was also included in the display. Well, that the promise was not fully kept was another matter, but in this instance, it's likely the Korean government will pursue a similar route, raising issues and demanding that the full disclosure is made so that the World Heritage Site, which is to be shared by the world community, will know the full extent and detail of that location.
Okay, and Professor, as I touched upon in the opening there, Japan apparently was going to shelve this nomination for a 12-month period, but went ahead with it anyway. Does this lend credence to those who say, particularly here in South Korea, that the relatively new Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida intends to continue this policy of whitewashing Japan's imperialist past, very much like his recent predecessors, Shinzo Abe? In particular, he was there for such a long time, and for a lesser extent, the short-lived Yoshihide Suga.
It seems that way. It's not surprising, though. Prime Minister Kishida was elected on the support of Shinzo Abe. I think that was decisive in being elected as a prime minister. So he's pursuing the similar direction when it comes to right-wing ideological tendencies in Japanese politics. So it's not strange to see that the same direction is being pursued. I think there's a little bit of twist here as well. An additional interesting note is that I mentioned the Hashima Island controversy. Current Prime Minister Kishida was then a foreign minister and in charge of the Hashima Island matter. And he was criticized because they had to take it with a condition of full disclosure. So I think there's a bit of personal vendetta included in here as well.
Now, Professor, the issue of forced labor is just one of the historical thorns in the side of Korea and Japan. For our international viewers, can you also touch upon some other historical issues between the two countries?
Well, I mentioned the Hashima Island, but a similar controversy has happened in the other locations of forced labor and also sex slave crimes during the World War II. And when the Korean judiciary decided to redress on the victims, Japanese government countered it with the trade embargo and the banning of the export of key materials. So this is not just a historical matter, it covers economic and diplomatic issues as well. And this is a kind of a consistent pattern that the Japanese revisionism in history has displayed over decades. That their historical textbook is skimpy on recent past after Meiji Restoration, and even the war crime issues, they focus on being victimized by the 2 nuclear bombs dropped on their soil, rather than focusing on other war crimes like Nanjing massacre and things like that. So those were the kinds of controversies that has cropped up from time to time and making it harder for the two governments to reconcile and go ahead with cooperation on economy and culture and other matters. So it has been thorny issues for decades.
Yeah, it's a real shame as well that this revisionism is continuing to the younger generations, because all the Japanese school textbooks include a lot of this whitewashing in them as well. Finally, a two-pronged question, more in regards to how South Korea plans to approach Japan in the coming years. In May, South Korea is going to have a new president. Now, the two leading frontrunners, Lee Jae-myung and Yoon Suk-yeol, I wanted to ask you, have they specifically laid out how they plan to approach Japan if they win the Blue House? And how much hope do you have, regardless of Seoul-Tokyo relations improving over the next 5 years?
Well, I hope it improves. It's better for neighbors to get along in general. But in this specific instance, both candidates have expressed their disapproval and opposition to what Japan is pursuing. Now, there was a sort of expectation that since Prime Minister Kishida is on the moderate side, the direction of reconciliation between the two diplomatic relations will improve. But it seems like their direction has not changed, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be a big improvement over the next 5 years. At least that's what the Korean media is saying, that's what Japanese media is saying, and unless their dialogue shifts in tone and directions, probably things will not improve. Now, I'm banking on the fact that Japan has expressed their willingness to engage in a dialogue on this specific issue. I think if the result is better, probably you can build on that achievement and move to other areas, especially in the economic cooperation and other social issues. But I hope that rather than this becoming another instance of a controversy between the two countries, I hope this one becomes kind of beginning of the reconciliation and better diplomatic relations, especially in face of our presidency election in a month, actually.
Let's hope the talks would go through well. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Song. We'll talk to you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to the Beijing Winter Olympics now, South Korea had, you could say, a deeply disappointing night on the ice on Monday evening as South Korean skaters in the men's 1,000 metre all failed to reach the final under highly controversial circumstances.
2 were disqualified and 1 suffered an injury. Our Min-soo-kan tells us more.
Monday's night's short track speed skating came as a crushing disappointment. All 3 South Korean semifinalists failed to make it to the finals of the men's 1,000-meter race. Hwang Dae-hyun, the world record holder in the event, crossed the finish line first in his semifinal heat. But he was later disqualified for making an illegal late pass that caused contact. Chinese skaters Lan Ju-wei and Lee Won-leung thereby advanced to the finals. In the next heat, Lee Jun-seo finished the race in second place, but he was also penalized for making a lane change that caused contact with Lee Sha-wang of Hungary. And earlier, a third South Korean skater Park Jang-hyuk withdrew from the semifinals after injuring his left hand during his 1,000-meter quarterfinal heat. Monday's results raised eyebrows as many South Korean fans found it hard to believe. Neither Hwang Dae-hyun nor Lee Jun-seo commented after their races. The Korean Sport and Olympic Committee said it will hold a press conference today at 11 a.m. Korean time. The committee also plans to submit a dispute to the Court of Arbitration for Sport to address the refereeing at the short track speed skating event. Meanwhile, at the women's 500-meter sprint, Choi Min-jung failed to get past the quarterfinals. With just 2 laps left in the 4.5-lap race, Choi unfortunately slipped and fell without contact. The short track speed skating event will resume on Wednesday with the men's 1,500-meter and the women's 1,000-meter and 3,000-meter relay. Min-soo-kan, Arirang News.
South Korean figure skating star Jun-hwan will aim to break his personal best this morning in the short program of the men's single skating event. Cha, who finished 15th 4 years ago in Pyeongchang, is aiming to finish in the top 10 in Beijing. Snowboarder Lee Sang-ho will complete his afternoon in the qualification round for men's parallel giant slalom. He won the silver in 2018, becoming the first South Korean snowboarder to win an Olympic medal. He says he's aiming to bring home the gold this time around.
Slovenia has won the first ever mixed team ski jumping event at the Olympic Games, or any Olympic Games. The team captured the gold medal with a total score of 1,000.5 points. The female members of the team also won medals in the women's individual event. The Russian Olympic Committee and Canada won silver and bronze respectively. Now, one of the favorites, Germany, that has won 4 successive mixed team world championships, had one of its athletes disqualified for a suit violation, so only 3 German jumpers were allowed to score.
Time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Tensions are continuing to grow as United States officials warn Russia is 70% ready to invade Ukraine, having built up a sizable military force along their borders. Ahead of US President Biden and his German counterpart Olaf Scholz's meeting on Monday, the German chancellor said that the West was unified in its approach to Russia. However, their attempts to talk it out with the Kremlin have so far failed. Can there be a breakthrough, and what will it take? To discuss the latest developments, I'm joined by Christopher Hartwell, head of the International Management Institute and Professor of International Business Policy at Saar School of Management and Law. We also connect with Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. Very warm welcome to you both. Thanks so much for joining us today. And well, Let's begin with you, Professor Hartwell. First, welcome back to the show. And, well, there's been a lot going on recently, recent weeks, days, and US intelligence officials, they've been warning that Russia is very close to invading Ukraine, 70%, they say. Would you agree with this number? How do you see the likelihood of this military operation happening?
Well, there's only one person in the world who knows this, and that's Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So you could say 70%, you could say 80%, you could say 0%. It doesn't really matter. I mean, we have seen a lot of things in the past few weeks that are troubling that we haven't seen before, but this isn't necessarily Putin's modus operandi. You know, he likes to do things with subterfuge. He likes to do his salami tactics. But we've seen kind of a large-scale mobilization. We've seen emptying, basically, of Russia's east in terms of military movement. And we've seen additional logistics, which we haven't seen beforehand. So if I were to hazard a guess, I'd say it's more likely than not, but it still could be some brinksmanship. It still could be saber rattling by Russia. The question still remains, why now? Why Ukraine now? And I don't think anyone has answered that. No one can, again, apart from Putin.
Ms. Herring, well, this is all very nerve-wracking news for Ukrainians. How are they reacting to this mounting military buildup?
So I just got back from Kiev, and the mood there is very weird. There is not as much traffic as normal. I got from the airport to my hotel in record time, but restaurants are full. Some people have gone out to the mountains or to a more protected part of Ukraine, but the Ukrainians I spoke with have said, we're not moving, we will resist. There's a new poll out from the Razumkov Center, which is a reliable, reputable firm, and 45% of Ukrainians told the firm that they will resist with armed force, and I think that number is probably low. So Ukrainians are defiant. They've been at this for 8 years. There's a long history of insurgency in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin knows that, and that's one of the factors that limits his ability to take a big swath of Ukraine.
And well, Professor Hartwell, the Ukrainian president, he seems a bit irked by the US and the global media really highlighting the growing tensions between Russia and Ukraine. And he said that he wants quiet military preparation and quiet diplomacy. Do you think that's possible?
Well, I mean, it's difficult because, as Melinda just said, the mood there is weird. And it seems like you don't want to have kind of the panic. Zelensky is trying to keep morale up, is trying to keep everyone together in the sense that, if something does happen, that we're going to need to draw on everyone, but we don't want to panic beforehand. And like Melinda said, the Ukrainians have been at this for 8 years. I mean, it's been localized to the east of the country, and maybe people in Lviv or in Kiev haven't felt kind of this kind of pain, this foreboding beforehand. And I think Zelensky really wants to forestall that so that it isn't a state of panic. On the other hand, I believe he's also trying to make the point that Ukraine is here and Ukraine is involved, and we are talking about Ukraine. And what we've seen is that Joe Biden and Scholz and other people, Macron, are talking about Russia and the West. And Zelensky is trying to say, well, what about Ukraine? Give us agency, put us front and center, because this is our country. This is going to be our graveyard if this happens.
And well, Ms. Herring, how do you see this? What are the steps that Ukrainians would like to see from their government and the West?
So Chris is right that President Zelensky wants to keep things calm. He's very angry at the United States and the UK because both of those embassies in Kiev evacuated their families, their non-essential staff. And he's afraid that that's going to trigger panic. And the Zelensky administration has had to prop up the hryvnia. The hryvnia, it's the Ukrainian currency. So there's real concern. And President Biden just made what I consider to be really foolish remarks. He said that all American citizens in Ukraine should go home now. I literally just got off the plane from Kiev, and I go there really regularly, and there is no danger whatsoever. If you're going to make a statement like that, you have to back it up with intelligence. So I don't understand why President Zelensky, or I don't understand why President Biden is ringing a bell right now and saying, get out of Kiev right now. I don't see the danger. And if I were President Zelensky, I would be furious that Biden has shot off his mouth again when there's probably a few more weeks. We're not in the danger zone yet. Most analysts think that if Putin's going to do something, and we don't know what he's going to do, I'd love to talk about the options, but it goes from salami tactics to full-scale land invasion, that we're not talking about that until mid-February, probably February 20th or after.
Then, Ms. Herring, then how do you see the prospects for negotiations? Do you think there is any way to diffuse the tensions right now?
No. I think that negotiations are on life support. We're seeing Macron going between Moscow and Kiev right now. And there is no room, as far as I can tell, for negotiation. We can talk about rearranging the furniture on the Titanic, but I'm sorry, Washington and Moscow fundamentally disagree about the open door policy. This goes back to 2008 in Bucharest. And Ukraine and Georgia were promised that they would be able to join NATO someday, but they were never told when. And so that's called the open door policy. And Russia fundamentally rejects that. Russia says that Ukraine, that Georgia, and that no one else should be a member of NATO. And NATO has said, no way. Moscow does not have veto policy over NATO membership. The United States has rejected that. Every single American president has to reject that. So we are at an impasse. There's no cute diplomatic formula that can get around this. There's some small things that we can talk about, but that's not what this is about. This is about who gets to be part of NATO and who doesn't. Russia wants a sphere of influence. It wants states in between it and NATO. It wants Ukraine to remain in its orbit. And it thinks that Ukraine is a small little state that it wants to use and put its feet up under. And it's not a real state. Vladimir Putin has written some essays in the last year that are outrageous. He says, my historical lands sit in Ukraine. Ukraine is a fake country. It is a fake language. And President Zelensky is not a legitimate president.
Professor Hobb, I'm curious to hear how you see this. Ukraine, of course, officially adopted a non-aligned status in 2010, thereby ruling out any future NATO membership bid. But this neutrality clearly did not prevent Putin from invading Ukraine just 4 years later. And Moscow, of course, and President Putin's essays, they've been emphasizing that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Do you think Putin is going to stop at a NATO neutrality, or will meeting his demands, will Western nations meeting his demands amount to appeasement?
Yes, it's appeasement. It's plain and simple. Like Melinda said, that we are at an impasse. This is a fundamentally different view of the world that you have from Washington, D.C. and that you have from Moscow. And this is not anything new for Russia. There's been worries of quote-unquote encirclement for 300, 400 years. This is Tsarist policy, this is Soviet policy, and this is Putin's policy. So this is nothing new. There's no way to be able to kind of assuage in Putin's mind that this is going to be the peace that then guarantees Russian security, because Russia has its own national interests, its own ideas about what it's going to do. It goes to Syria, it goes to Mali, it goes to other places in the world, and brings havoc and destruction, of course. But this is what it sees as kind of its national interest, and it sees Ukraine especially as its national interest. Throwing Ukraine to Putin is only going to make the bear hungrier. And like Melinda said, this kind of view of Ukraine of not being a real nation, where does it end? Where do you go next and say, what is the next not real nation? Georgia? Any place in the Caucasus? Any place in Central Asia? Kazakhstan? We've heard that one before, that northern Kazakhstan was mostly Russian, so perhaps ethnicity is the issue there. Where does it end? And it has to end here.
Well, Ms. Herring, US officials have been talking about stronger sanctions and export control. What are the options being discussed right now, and do you think any of these measures are going to work?
I don't think it's enough to deter Vladimir Putin. So you need two things if you're going to deter Vladimir Putin. You need the meanest, nastiest package of sanctions you can put together. And the White House has done that. So on a 1 to 10 point scale, we're at about a 2 or a 3 now. And the new package of sanctions that Biden and the Western allies are considering is more like an 8 or a 9. So it's serious. It will get Vladimir Putin's attention, but there's a problem. Vladimir Putin has $630 billion in reserves. So he can afford this, and he's priced in sanctions. He doesn't like it. He doesn't want more sanctions. And if he can get what he wants without sanctions, he'll do it. But the bottom line is he can afford it if he decides that this is really, really important. So you can't just do sanctions, though. You also have to do deterrence. Here's where I don't think the West has played a very good game. The Biden administration has gradually increased and is starting to send more troops and more defensive material. Great. Send more now. There's not much time left, and we don't have any time to waste. NATO needs to be sending more troops to Eastern Europe as well. We need to do everything we can right now to deter Vladimir Putin, and the Ukrainians need to be doing more. I was horrified when I was in Kiev and I found out that the Ukrainians haven't done more to fortify the northern border. Ukraine has a very, very long, unprotected border between Ukraine and Russia. It's super long and it's unprotected, and the Ukrainians need to fortify it as soon as possible.
And Professor Hartwell, of course, the Americans and the Europeans need to come together on this. And while the German Chancellor, who met with President Biden on Monday, he's been facing growing criticism over his seeming reluctance to take a stronger position against Russia's actions. How close or how far apart are the US and Germany in terms of responding to the Kremlin? And do you think they're going to be able to coordinate their views?
Well, I wish I were a little bit more optimistic, like Melinda, in terms of the sanctions going up to 8 or 9, because I would say that the meeting of minds between Scholz and Biden is basically the meeting of two greatest enablers of getting us to where we are right now, Nord Stream 2 and the lack of sanctions on Nord Stream 2. And the continued kind of excuses that have been made, first in the Obama administration, and then now kind of under Biden, for Putin, the lack of the deterrent that has been built up to this point has led us to this kind of position where we are now. Germany has been a major enabler, obviously former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who is on the board of Gazprom and who is carrying water for the Russians in Germany. I think there is a lot in common between the German approach and the current presidential administration in the United States. I worry that that's where the convergence is going to be, and that when push comes to shove, that Ukraine will get thrown under the bus because it is not as important as other kind of broader European security architecture or energy supplies right here in Europe, and that Ukraine is going to suffer because of that.
And Ms. Herring, would you agree with that view? Do you think that is the fate of Ukraine that we're looking at right now?
I am not betting on the Europeans. I'm betting on the Ukrainians. Like I said before, 45% of Ukrainians say that they're going to fight. And I spent a lot of time reporting in Ukraine over the last 7 years. They will fight. They're resilient. I'm not very impressed with what little they've done right now to harden their borders. But it's not going to be a cakewalk for Vladimir Putin if he decides to invade Ukraine again. The Brits have been very impressive, I will say that. They keep sending more and more material. And I was just in Paris as well. And I think that Paris may be changing its line as well. I think that they are increasingly annoyed at Vladimir Putin, his exploits in Mali and in the Sahel. And I think they're increasingly annoyed at all of the cyber hacking. So hopefully Paris will start. I think Paris is also sending more material and expressing a greater role. And Merkel's gone now. This is Macron's moment to be the leader of Europe. So I hope that he seizes it as well.
Well, I hope we will see that after the French elections, of course. And well, this is where we'll have to end the interview today. That was Christopher Hartwell, Professor at Zuhl School of Management and Law, and Melinda Herring, Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank
you.
you.
The South Korean Army has started using robots to help prepare food for military trainees in a bid to improve the quality of meals for service members. The system is also aimed at reducing the workload of military cooks. Bae Eun-ji has this report.
A series of robots prepare food at a military boot camp. They're capable of deep frying, stir frying, boiling, and steaming food.
Since last November, these robots have been helping to prepare meals at a boot camp in the city of Nonsan, Chungcheongnam province. With the help of these robot chefs, military cooks no longer have to stir-fry foods in hot oil. Instead, they only have to put the ingredients in the pan, and the robot does the rest. This is part of the government's efforts to improve the quality of everyday meals for military service members. This comes after photos of meals uploaded on social media by some service members sparked controversy over the poor quality of food being served to them. The defense minister visited the site on Monday and said the implementation of robotic services will also reduce the workload and the risk of injury for military cooks.
We believe this automated and standardized cooking system will improve the quality of meals for troops. It will also reduce the workload for our military cooks that had to prepare large amounts of food and prevent them from injuries such as burns.
Last August, the country's Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy had announced that it will expand the use of robots in the defense industry. The Trade and Industry Minister, who was also at the boot camp on Monday, said it will cooperate with the Defense Ministry to begin using robots in various defense areas. Peunji, Arirang News.
And now for a look at stories going on around the world, we connect to our Lee Seung-jae joining us from Arirang's newsroom. Good morning, Seung-jae.
Good morning to you guys.
So let's start with the stalled 2015 Iran nuclear deal. We have an 8th round of talks in Vienna on Tuesday after more than 1 week of delay.
That's right. So what we're looking at right now is political delegations from Iran and world powers due to return to Vienna on Tuesday for what could potentially be the final stretch of efforts to restore this landmark accord. Now, while different sides have said real progress has been made, others say there are still significant hurdles remaining in trying to reach this agreement to revive the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, they say they include the fact that the Iranian government still refuses to talk directly with the United States, who, of course, unilaterally abandoned the deal back in 2018. Meanwhile, Iranian officials said Monday that the future of the nuclear deal relies on whether or not Western parties fulfill Tehran's expectations for sanctions relief. Now, massive bushfires in the Wheat Belt region of Western Australia sent a large plume of smoke and dust into the sky on Sunday, as multiple warnings are in place. According to authorities, the bushfires are moving very quickly, with the state seeing at least half a dozen homes destroyed and over 60,000 hectares of bushland burnt. More than 1,300 people were fighting the blazes, with the vast majority of them volunteers. The massive fire comes as the region faces 4 level 3 bushfires occurring at the same time. Now, over in India, female Muslim students in the country's southern Karnataka state protested on Monday against the government's latest decision to ban students from wearing hijabs and burqas in colleges. Now, hundreds of protesters who were seen wearing hijabs and burqas took to the streets, demanding the withdrawal of the decision.
We will enter wearing hijabs. We will not remove them until we receive a high court order.
Now, the protests come as the Karnataka state government last week issued an order imposing a ban on wearing hijabs and burqas, stating that they tend to disturb integrity, equality, and public order. Now, as protests took place across the state, one college was seen allowing students wearing hijabs to enter the premises, but they were seated in separate classrooms. And now celebrations all across Senegal as the country's national football team received a hero's welcome upon their arrival in Dakar on Monday with the Africa Cup of Nations trophy. The team were met by President Macky Sall, with the government declaring a national holiday to celebrate the historic win. Now on Sunday, Senegal defeated Egypt on penalties, claiming their first ever Cup of Nations title after falling just short in 2002 and 2019.
Good morning. The air feels a bit more bearable this morning. Morning temperatures in the capital are about 3 degrees higher than the same time yesterday. Afternoon highs will also go above seasonal norms this afternoon. But a lack of humidity in the air continues. The further east you are, the drier the air is. And it seems like Busan has been under dry alerts for most of winter this year. And the capital remains under a dry weather advisory. Meanwhile, thankfully, the air quality will be normal to good across Korea today. Central inner regions are under a cold wave advisory this morning, which should be lifted as the day goes on. In Daegu and Gyeongju are starting the day at -4 degrees Celsius. Afternoon highs will be 3 to 5 degrees higher this afternoon. Seoul will be at 5 degrees. Gwangju, Daegu topping out at 8 degrees Celsius under mostly sunny skies in most parts. Temperatures will gradually rise, and this weekend, we're looking at the highs of 9 degrees Celsius here in the capital. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Wednesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Broom. We appreciate you joining us every day. Until next time, goodbye.